Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm not muted. Really excited for this panel and honored to be able to moderate. We're going to give some quick introductions, round robin, and then we're just going to jump into it. My name is Mark Little. I work at UNC Chapel Hill. Here I lead a economic development center called CREATE. We partner with local governments and businesses and economically distressed communities across North and South Carolina on strategies to grow more, better jobs in places that they are. Also am co-chair with Carlos Slocum, also here at UNC Chapel Hill, of the Black Communities Conference, which we had our first virtual one a few weeks ago. So really excited to host this. And Javon, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Odetta and round out with Irvin, and then I'll have a question for the panel.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Really happy to be here. I love the last session, so I'm hoping we can continue some of those themes in our conversation today. I'm Javon Scott Lewis. I am an associate professor and department chair of geography at UC Berkeley. At Berkeley, I also co-lead the Economic Disparities Research Cluster at the campus's Othering and Belonging Institute. And starting this summer, I will be serving on the State of California's Operations Task Force. So, we'll see what happens. But outside of that, my work deals with questions of reparations, social, racial, and economic inequality in the Caribbean, as well as the United States. For the past 7 years, I've been doing research in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Odetta McLeish-White. I am the Director for Georgia Initiatives with the Center for Community Progress, which is a national nonprofit that focuses on technical assistance, policy work, and support for local governments and communities around vacant, abandoned, and deteriorating properties. My personal goal in this work is to deliver land as an asset to the people. That is coming straight out of my prior work, where I was the managing director here in Atlanta for the Transformation Alliance, which is a coalition of about 35 members focused on strengthening communities through transit and through supporting equitable transit-oriented development. And one of my big frustrations was always running up against the fact that community did not actually own a lot of the property that they live next to. And so my work with CCP is hopefully going to help shift some of that dynamic and support the other actors that community need to get their visions into reality. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Irvin Henderson. I am a for-profit developer that concentrates on urban infill, historic preservation, a lot of mixed-use, multifamily development, and I typically work in underserved communities more than anywhere else. I have been around this space for a number of years. I also work in the community reinvestment space and founded the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which is our country and our world's largest CRA entity. I'm a board member emeritus of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I spend a great deal of time working on our kind of main streets as well as other main streets. I'm a board member of the National Main Street Center. I also help with capital formation, put together a couple of mutual funds that have grown to $2 billion. Community Capital Trust is our overall platform. And I'm really, really glad to be here, especially with so many bright presenters. Glad to be a part.
All right, so jump into this. I just want to tell the audience that I'm welcome to take questions throughout. I can try to weave them in, so please go ahead and get them into your chat, and we'll get them to the panel. Also, this is fortunately a panel that can talk about nitty-gritty detail of actually how you do something, but also taking a step way back and think, what can the future be like for our children, grandchildren, and then how do you connect that to reality? So there was a quote that came up in the last panel, empathetic capital. I hadn't heard that phrase before. And so my first question for this panel is, what if you don't have empathetic capital? And so the question is, besides cash on hand, what kind of power do communities have to navigate or control a development process, either from inception, development to execution? And so we're thinking about neighborhoods, cities, or even individuals. So besides having a bank account, what kind of power do people actually have to navigate and control development process? Maybe in reverse order. So maybe start with Irvin and then Odetta and then Javon.
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate the question. People in the community have the ultimate power to either embrace a development strategy or to stop one, because all developers, me included, have to go through the entitlements process. You have to deal with planning and zoning. You have to deal with the council persons or the alder persons. And as you attempt to get your project approved, you've got to work with those in the community who are stakeholders who can either embrace your project, as I said, or stop it. Now, people say, well, how do you stop a project? Believe me, you bring 45, 50 people to a planning board meeting and you indicate that you are not enamored with what has been put forward, and you will get an audience. But it's more than just protest. It's also giving input, saying these are what our needs are. So when the consolidated plan is being put together for housing in your area, you need to be there as a voice. When the economic development commissions meet, you need to be there as a voice. You need to have your own institutions and your own organs in terms of media and everything else, where you can put forward your vision, your voice, and how you want your needs taken care of. And believe me, the smart developer will listen and will collaborate. The ignorant developer will march ahead without support and may find that they've lost a lot of money.
Great. So I think it's important to remember that all of the systems that go into creating a project are not created. They were not created for the thriving of Black communities. In fact, they were all created, right, to manage where Black people and marginalized people can live or should be allowed to live, how much access they have to resources, you know, how intricate the process is for some people, but can be backdoored for other people. I say that because across the development spectrum, and I started my career in affordable housing, the developer, so that was sort of my initial intake moment of, wow, the paperwork, the meetings, the, you know, the privilege that is actually reflected in being able to take time to go to any meeting. When are they planned? Where are they being held? Are your trusted partners able to get in the room to express community need? None of these processes, from planning, zoning, financing, procurement, were originally intended to support Black thriving. So when I hear things like empathetic capital, to me that interprets as like Black capital, like Black people have to have their allies have to have a way to provide models of financing and activism, so that what the community wants can be realized. Here in Atlanta, the other thing, because we're going to go back to this site control issue, absolutely we can have activism when the property is held by somebody else, and it's usually a white developer who already have their ways to affect decision makers, right? You can get a lot of activism and activity, and then the project goes through anyway, right? It goes through anyway. So how to disrupt that kind of thing is a real challenge, especially when the development timeline is one of, let's speed it up so I can get on to the next thing and get my return. And the trust building timeline with community is all about, how many meetings do I have to have with Ms. Jones at her house? It could be 5, or, you know, I mean, these are two diametrically opposed timelines that have to somehow be brought together. So there's a lot there to unpack about, like, who is this capital even for? Who are these processes for? In what space can we create to shift them for the benefit of Black people and community and their thriving, and not just the benefit of anyone else, quite frankly, or any other system that wasn't created for them to thrive?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question, and Irvin, Odetta, thank you so much for you know, those early responses, because what comes to my mind in thinking about the question and actually thinking about the responses that Irvin and Odetta have offered, you know, are the many conversations I've had with people, say in Tulsa, where they are utterly exhausted by attending meetings, right? And they begin to read that as a form of, or as a strategy for undermining their capacity to have a say in what the development looks like, right? what the kind of implications or consequences of the development will be. And so, what that brings to mind is the capital that I can call a kind of capital of the imaginary, right? Meaning a lot of these community members feel, uninvolved in the actual process of imagining what their community will be. And the only way that they can, have a say is by attending these meetings, which, frankly, are really difficult to attend. And, you can sit in a meeting for 4 or 5 hours and nothing is accomplished, right? There's a tactic to bureaucracy in a way that is antithetical to the kind of collectivism that a lot of community members want to kind of have or participate in terms of the form. So I think, in terms of thinking about empathetic capital, in terms of thinking about what it takes, right, we have to actually think about, this level of community engagement, which oftentimes is obviated because there is the kind of presumption of access. Well, you have a right to come to these meetings and to have a say, right? Regardless of whether or not getting to those meetings is convenient, right? Regardless of whether, the real issue of capital is time capital. This is what that is getting us to think about, right? Time capital, or the poverty of time, is one that, doesn't always get factored into into these equations, right, of access. So I think, the opening up of the question of what capital means, how it operates, right, what it's qualified by, I think gets us, much closer to understanding why, at the end of the day, the development still proceeds, right, regardless of what the community feeling is. And I think that's a really wonderful thing to kind of consider as we kind of think about the various actors who are involved in that process.
Thank you, Mark, for letting me just add one more thing on to this. I read an article, which I've just dropped, that Carmen will share momentarily. It is just as a little bit of a content warning. It is about sexual consent and touch. So for anyone for whom that might be sensitive, just that little warning. But what I found fascinating about this discussion, this article, was the idea of empty consent, which I think is what too many communities experience when it comes to development in their neighborhoods. And Javon, what you're describing is a form of empty consent, right? At some point you're like, well, sure, I can't make it to the meeting. There's this default consent, but it is empty. It is devoid of empathy. It is devoid of, Irvin, to your point, the kind of support that a developer should be wanting, right? And there might be ways to incent developers through changes to a pro forma, to financing that pays a developer to do community engagement months ahead. Like, I get it, the developer has they've got a goal too on this thing. So there are places we could maybe support that. But I just want to throw into the mix this idea of empty consent. And when are we subjecting communities to empty consent about what is happening in their physical space? Because our procedures and bureaucracies say, well, we made a meeting, we had a meeting, and this is the process. And so if you can make it, you can make it. If you can't, you kind of consented, but you haven't really.
Well, I too appreciate the comments that are made by Javon and Odetta. I do want to answer a question that's been placed in the chat where we talk about, suppose the developer is moving ahead by right. I think you have to really look at the example that's the Hill community in Pittsburgh, where the Hill CDC under Marima Malayan's leadership, and Marima was a presenter yesterday, by the way, they put together, and I worked with them on this, something called the Hill District Master Plan. And it's an overlay district, and it's a set of rules and responsibilities that forces developers to come before a community review commission at the time that the community review commission sets. So in other words, they have structurally put in strictures that keep anyone from being able to go around that. And I would say most communities really have an opportunity to do this where you have some political leadership, and I mean some, not a majority, some political leadership that can horse trade with their colleagues, sorry about that, and get before the bodies so that you can institute something like this. And there's one last thing that I want to talk about, and I'll call them our gray Black Panthers. We have to know that the retired community can be placed into service here. They can make some meetings that others can't make. So in other words, it's in our best interest to be in a position where we have different kind of foot soldiers who can go around the intentional hurdles that are placed that are placed there. No question that these are problematic, and no question that we want to holistically work to remove those kind of hurdles. But where those hurdles are in place, then we just have to work with others. Excuse me for just a minute.
Somebody needs to talk to Irvin.
I know exactly who it is, so I really don't need to talk to them. so we'll continue. Go right ahead.
Yeah, no, this really, I appreciate it. This makes me think, I mentioned that we work in North and South Carolina, and it's also very, very diverse, this kind of relationship between communities and how they're able to navigate these systems. I work in some rural communities, majority Black counties that don't have majority Black political leadership, and you can get away with a lot of things that are actually illegal in terms of notification of when meetings are happening. And so that's, meetings change location last minute, things like that, to prevent community members from actually even being able to get to those meetings where their voice can be heard. I think there's also kind of two levels. One is there's these, series of meetings and procedures that, for the majority of neighborhoods, this is what's been created for them to navigate this. And then I think, Odetta, you mentioned there are also some pathways around that, right? So we can kind of come back to how do you get around that in a second, but neighborhood to neighborhood is also quite interesting. I'm here at UNC Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, North Carolina is one of the, it's very, very wealthy community, and the neighborhoods here, when they're aware of something that is going to be built years in advance, there's a website. There's, and so the developer comes to them, right? It's not them going to, they create a whole infrastructure to really say, look, if you're going to do anything, we're going to control that. And so, while there's significant cost to that, I do think the costs of that are coming down, and so that I think there are some things to be learned from some of that. But if that's what's required, it also means that these systems that are created supposedly for neighborhoods, people to navigate this, they're not really working, right? People have to create that. So then, happy to have people respond to that, but then also just want to throw another question out, because I think underlying this are some assumptions about what developers can and can't get out of doing things the right way, right? And so maybe we also have a little discussion about what does a developer gain from being open to and welcoming and very deliberate about getting early consent, input, engagement with Black communities that may be near a potential development or actually where the development might happen.
Well, I just want to start the conversation. What a developer may get from that early interaction is a much better project, because you may change the details of how you're planning on developing the space, the outdoor area, whatever it is you're developing. When you have a better appreciation of what your market wants, then you have a much better chance of being aligned with a project that's going to be successful. So you learn about the positives of your project as proposed, and you learn about the negatives, and you can make early changes that will make a difference. The other piece is some municipalities have set it up such that community support may lessen your regulatory burden, and community support may often give you access to pools of capital that you wouldn't get otherwise. And so that's very important. But the last thing is, you're going to get an answer. Today's national funding sources, national investors are going to ask you a question. I said you're going to get an answer. You're going to get a question. Prove to me how the community supports this project, and prove to me that we won't put our capital in, and 2 weeks later we've got protest signs outside of your project site. Those are all things that the developer gets.
and they get time, right? I mean, if you get your approvals worked out with the community ahead of time, you get to your planning meeting and they are not waiting there saying, no, 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 we have things to say before, right? So you, on the idea that time is money in a development situation, you can save yourself some time as well, which is not unimportant in sort of in continuing on down the road. You know, this idea of the things that I've observed in the past, though, is, to your point, Mark, like, which community representative can you go to, right? If as a developer you cultivate a relationship with someone that isn't necessarily a legacy resident or someone that's, you know, that they can sign the letter or be in a position to sign a letter that says the community approves this. In Florida, when I lived in Florida some years ago now, but there was something called the Front Porch Florida program. And what it did was designate communities as front porch communities, which then they would put together delegations of residents from these designated communities, and they would get training. And as a developer, I had the experience of going to ask for the approval of this entity for our application for low-income housing tax credits, right? And the first time we asked for this approval letter, we got one set of questions, but they were much, I don't know how to say it, they were more about, well, we don't trust you. No, you know, the second time we went back, after that group had gone through some training and gotten information, and let's remember, these communities are full of intelligent, trained people. They just need some information, right? The quality of the questions they asked us were very different. Some were more challenging, but they were making us think in better ways about how we're going to hire, what is the community benefits, you know, like, these are the quality of the question changed. That's another thing too, is if you put in the time to give community information, they will be partners. They will ask you a different and sometimes better type of question to the benefit of the project. And then you will also have, hopefully, smoothed some of the way and smoothed out some of the friction towards getting your approvals from the planning and the zoning board.
Thank you for that. So I still think we're talking about, in a kind of a broad realm of developers and even the broader municipal governments that at least are interested in hearing from Black voices. And that doesn't include every place. So we do have places that are very, you know, just interested in their Black communities, whether because they're just actually racist or something you mentioned, most folks are not landowners, aren't property owners, right, or renting. So I want to take maybe a little step back and kind of thinking about a Black community as a place. And I mean, this, we don't need to use we could use the rest of our time to explore this, but just thinking about it in terms of development, what is a Black place and why is that threatening to some members outside of Black neighborhoods in cities? Because the kind of resistance oftentimes there is to Black controlled development or development in Black places that financially benefits people living in those places, there's oftentimes a lot of resistance to that. And so just wanted to kind of step back and think a little bit like, you know, when we don't have Irvin to deal with, right? Or, you know, or Odetta in the past, like, what are Black communities actually up against that they may not see, they may not really, but they feel it?
Mm-hmm. You know, I thought about this last night, so I have a succinct answer that I wanted to give you. It's past or current occupancy by folk that are part of the whole Black diaspora, or it is history of Black folks being in that place. So it's both. It's we were either there before or we're there now, or our history was there before, or there's history that's connected to now. Both of those make it a Black place from our perspective.
I think that's a very brilliant answer, Irvin. I mean, when we think about, you know, Black emplacement, you know, there is at the root of it, you know, for the most part, a a very contentious history, regardless if we're thinking about, post-emancipation Southern geographies, or we're thinking about, the aspirant migrations west and north, after Reconstruction. There is that component of struggle as investment that I think underpins some of that Black placemaking, right? What you have then is that feeding into what Irvin is identifying, right, as the kind of history of the work that went into making a community, of one's own making. Or the struggle that is, as we're seeing today. I'm in the Bay Area, right? It's a constant struggle here for lots of people. But when we're thinking about the Black population, I'm in Oakland, in Berkeley. We're thinking about South Berkeley, historical Black community, now largely, if not marginalized, and certainly, if not displaced, then certainly marginalized. What then makes a Black place is that struggle to remain, right? And so it's a struggle to become present, and it's a struggle to remain. And so that, that's also really unfortunate, right? Because what that does is it limits the kind of scope of imagination, right? Where, a community can decide what it wants to become, right? So when a community is spending its time in survival mode, which we can argue has been centuries long, it is really difficult to, one, imagine what you want your community to be, right? And two, to really develop the resources to make that possible, or at least resources that are significant enough to kind of counter, the resources that a developer or that the local government may have in comparison to then execute their imaginations, right? And so what we see is now the kind of struggle is one of imaginations, going back to my earlier answer, right? So in Oakland, right, what you have, right, are, developers wanting to create a particular sense of Oakland, which is an extension effectively of San Francisco across the bay. And as a result, you have Black Oaklanders trying to fight to kind of, continue to be able to exert their sense of place. So which is why, historically, thinking, going back to Tulsa for a moment, there was a moment before Oklahoma became a state, right? So Nell Painter wrote a beautiful book, Exodusters, right? There's the history of Black migration out of the South, prior to the Great Migration, right after Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction. And so what Indian Territory represented, right, so which became the state of Oklahoma, when Black people arrived there, in a second wave, right, because it's important to remember that Black people arrived in Indian Territory as part of the Trail of Tears. But when they arrived in the late 1880s, right, this was 20 plus years before Oklahoma became a state. There was a brief window, right, where there was access to land, there was access to tools, right, there was access to capital, right? And what you saw with the development of all Black towns, and Greenwood, should be seen as a form of an all Black town, given that it was founded 1 year literally before statehood, was this opportunity to kind of come up with an imagination and to also have the tools to execute that imagination. What we see with so many Black communities since then, right, or outside of that, and this is not to say that Greenwood was an exception or that Indian Territory was an exception, because there were pockets of openness, and I won't say freedom, right, but of opportunity, right? I'm thinking about, in South, so I've also, I went to school in South Florida, right? So we can think about Overtown, Liberty City, we can think about Little Haiti actually, as well as representing perhaps very briefly what I'm trying to get at here. But what I'm saying is that, what we have today is really a kind of, again, a poverty of opportunity to imagine, and to also, kind of command and marshal the resources, to gain the resources, to execute that imagination. So what we have right now is a sense of Black place as being, this imaginary that is one rooted in struggle, in contest, in refusal, in resistance. But what we have to also do is we have to kind of, develop the opportunity for that to be, a community of imagination. And what is it that we want our communities to be, beyond just as a site of resistance?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. You know, I was intrigued when I came into the prior panel as they were talking, you know, starting to talk about Afrofuturism a little bit. And I think that Afrofuturism is very much displayed by Black community in how they try to create safe spaces. When you speak, Mark, about who should be threatened and who should not be threatened. When a culture says that the mere presence of Black skin on land devalues the land itself, right? That is setting up a scenario where you are vulnerable to whenever that dominant culture says, you're ready to come take your land, and it will be cheap. Your life is cheap and your land is cheap in our construct, right? So, Jovan, your South Florida example, now that we have climate impact, and you might have, you know, Black communities and immigrant communities that were placed in certain parts of the city, right? They were there for a reason. They congregated together in response to certain things, right? But they're also high ground, right? They are further away from what used to be desirable, which was waterfront, but now that's dangerous. But because it's Black and immigrant people, it's cheaper to go get their land to build housing to protect the wealthy and the white who are now fleeing climate change. So I think that Black people have always known precarious nature because they know we are not valued, right? So if we're going to construct a place for ourselves and we try to buy into the imagination, Greenwood was an example, you know, a little too much, and you are going to catch the attention of people who are okay with you not existing and are very okay with taking your land cheaply and then valuing it up, right? Then making it valuable and expensive. We could talk about the first peoples, right? Whose thousands of generations of stewardship of land meant nothing when it became time to move you all out so we can get the gold under the land, right? So who should feel threatened are the people of color, and the ways in which Afrofuturism shows up to me are the farmers in Southwest Georgia who created the land trust model, right? Not to provide affordable housing for retirement, but to save land for their future, right? For their family. So to me, that's part of Afrofuturism, is how we are constantly trying to create and project and like astral project ourselves into a future where we're valued, our property is protected, and because we also are aware, and you know, this panel is talking about 21st century Greenwood. So I want to just sort of pull in the idea that land is so important. We're talking about districts, we're talking about development. In the 21st century, we also got to be talking about intellectual property. If we're going to talk about artists and griots and others, Black people create culture all the time. It is taken away. Originators are kind of annihilated from view. If Greenwood was annihilated from view, and the product gets, you know, taken off and monetized somewhere else. So, you know, that all of those dynamics are feeding into who should feel threatened, but also suggests how we need to protect. And then we can talk further about strategies, you know, to protect intellectual property and our, you know, physical, literal property.
Yeah, I think these issues around how property is valued are really important. I started watching High on the Hog last night, which is about similar to these themes about foodways that Black people have created and how those are extracted and people aren't given credit. But it also talks some about land, and there's one part talking about Black folks having access to poor quality land, making it generative, but then having it taken away again once it becomes valuable again. And so this process of having to move back and forth is common, and it's not just in the United States. In Halifax province in Canada, there's a community called Africville that formed kind of organically on the bay, but when that property was needed for commercial development, the community was moved. And so this is a common kind of thing, and oftentimes Black people don't get the value of those transactions. And so that's kind of, I want to go back to maybe some more technical detail and ask a question about what are some of the technical tools for communities to gain some more sort of financial traction when these things are happening. And so one of the ones that came in the chat was community benefit agreements. Another one are sort of creative property tax agreements that prevent residents from having the property taxes immediately rise as a community is being developed and property taxes broadly are increasing. So maybe the panel can talk about if you do have the ability to get some policies actually changed on a municipal or county level, what are the kinds of things that can make people who have maybe own a home or communities, neighborhoods, have some more like real actual power in those exchanges, so that, and like I said, financial power really.
Well, I'm so happy that we're actually getting to this because there are some very important tools. You mentioned community benefit agreements. Carlton Brown and I, my development partner, actually met during a past forward live streaming projection around community benefits and developers. I was moderating, he was there. We were both talking about the importance of developers who embrace community benefit agreements. But, essentially a community benefit agreement is simply a contract between community residents and developers as to how they're going to enhance the capital infusion that they're bringing to a neighborhood, but everything from the social aspects of their development to the hard aspects of what's in the development and how public capital can be used in a more creative way. But the other elements that you mentioned, Mark, there's what we call legacy property tax rates versus current property tax rates. So the way that you keep existing businesses, existing residents from being thrown out of a gentrifying area. And a little bit of gentrification is what you want to bring up an area, but you don't want wholesale gentrification that pushes out the stakeholders. So a legacy tax approach means that their property taxes don't go up as the area gentrifies and goes up in value. And the new residents, the new business residents or actual homeowners actually come in and pay the higher rate. But another term that is not talked about as much is inclusionary zoning. See, we're used to seeing inclusionary zoning when it comes to residential, but what I propose and what I promote is commercial inclusionary zoning. If I'm coming in and developing what was a Black business district, like the 4th Avenue Business District in Birmingham, I don't want my new commercial residents that are going to be paying a hugely high rent. I don't want them and their rent to have to be the bar that exists for existing businesses. I want to have some places within a structure like the Masonic Temple that's being developed in 4th Avenue, where some folks are going to pay $10 a square foot because we want them there. And some other commercial tenants are going to pay $26 a square foot because that's market. And see, these are the kind of tools you're talking about.
Yeah, I would want to make sure they understand a community benefits agreement as a legal document and a legal process versus a plan, right? So as a community asking for a community benefits agreement for the legally binding components that it would bring. The idea of managing property tax is absolutely a great idea, an important thing, and just being aware of, how many cycles of ownership does that property tax hold for? If it's for the original legacy resident, but maybe their child has been living in the house as well. If some programs don't allow the property tax to travel over to the child when the first, so just looking, right, and making sure you understand the longevity of the help that some of these interventions provide, and if you can get them longer, get that. But if not, at least being aware of it and not being caught off guard is really important. And I had another thought that went away, but if it comes back, I'll drop it in again. But yeah, so I definitely think those are for sure two moments that can help. Yeah.
So it sounds like the community benefit agreement is kind of like a prenup, so to speak. It can really contain anything, right?
We want prenup. We want prenup.
I want to shift a little bit to thinking about sort of entities that actually do have a significant power and wealth within Black communities, and how they can be leveraged or partners in developing communities. And so those being historically Black colleges and universities, the Black church, and then also outside of a urban context, rural Black folks. I mean, there are a significant number of landowners, Black landowners in rural places. So maybe just, whoever would like to speak first, thinking about, what is that sort of untapped potentially power that those entities have? And if you have any examples or ways that they can partner with communities, again, to exert more control of this process. And maybe even, we've been talking about how does a neighborhood or a Black community respond to a developer who's interested in building something, but there's also communities who may want to do something themselves, right? And so how do you begin that process? And thinking about in that context, those partners, whether it's churches or HBCUs or other larger Black landowners, how can they be leveraged in those situations?
If I could just jump in to say one thing, and then I'm happy to be quiet for a little long. So in that context, so you might have entities that have access to the property. This is a moment where maybe you're not so much dealing with who has site control. Somebody's got site control, but they still need development partners, right? Or they need somebody that kind of understands that process. And so what I wanted to say here is there is such a need for kind of right-thinking Black development partners. Which can range in scale. You could have, folks who are interested in infill, right? They want to do those small sort of targeted, kind of developments. You can have folks that are down for the, hundreds of LIHTC units, right? Black excellence can show up everywhere. So let's get it all. But the point is to have, when you are inherently a risk because of your brown skin to a financial institution, right? I think Black developers as a partner in this discussion face their own barriers that make it hard for them to show up ready to go. And some will overcome and make it happen, but too many spend a lot of their brilliance trying to figure out, why can I get this pre-development funding, and how am I going to get more money for my pro forma? And you don't even have time to network the way some are. That's a form of privilege, to have the time to go network with people that might result in funding or help, right? So I think we really have to talk about strategies for the partners who will come alongside an HBCU, a faith institution, anyone like that, and be ready to act as a development partner, and not also overcoming their own barriers to capacity. We should be investing in that capacity of that development partner, Black development partners, so that they can be the co-visionaries and the co-creators with communities and those who have site control.
So that question brings to mind one of my first research trips to Tulsa, when this is in 2014, and the local grocery store in North Tulsa, where I did most of my field work, had closed, and there had been a history of a lack of access to grocery stores. And so I went to several meetings by the community about opening a grocery store. And I remember the flyer. It was titled "An All Call for All People," and the organizers listed all of the different kinds of people that were needed to create a grocery store. It was calling teachers, lawyers, doctors. It was everybody. You know what I mean? And I remember thinking about that, as I saw the flyer, about community, about capital, about what it takes to get something like a grocery store built. And Mark, this community wanted to do it on their own, right? Because what they had experienced was the store, a national chain, Albertsons, had come in and had left. The city of Tulsa had provided a local grocery store owner who ran a series of Latin American grocery stores in another part of the city. He was awarded a $2 million grant to open up a grocery store for North Tulsa. When he wasn't turning a profit, he shuttered the grocery store. So here was a community that learned that both the conventional form of the provision of this particular service, this need, right, would not work, right? They also saw that while another minority, someone who was not from within their community, right, with state support, right? So in this case, the state had directly supported the development of this grocery store, ultimately abandoned or was able to abandon their community. And so they were fed up and said, we need something for ourselves. So when we're in these meetings, it was, the solutions went from everything from the church to, at the time, Kevin Durant was still playing for OKC. Oh, I think I know Kevin Durant's mom. We could maybe talk to her, and maybe she could talk to KD. And, and so what was so fascinating was that there was, first, such creativity, right, in like thinking of potential sites of capital, but a real lack of full understanding as to how capital works around these kinds of projects. What happened was several years later, and it opened this past week, Oasis Fresh Market opened in North Tulsa. Now, so finally got a grocery store, right? And when you look at how the grocery store came about, the number one backer for this grocery store was a series of local philanthropies in North Tulsa. And so what you see, is an unexpected, but also, to my mind, troubling source of capital. Because with the philanthropies, right, there, as is the case in other areas, right, philanthropies largely fund a lot of North Tulsa's educational, sites, especially early childhood education schools. There is something that comes along with that gift of money. So for me, there's a question where for North Tulsans, right, the church wasn't enough, right? KD's mom and KD, wouldn't get it done. And ultimately they ended up relying on philanthropies because the state also wouldn't work. So for me, that is a kind of devastating lesson, right, about the limits of community capital, the limits of the ability to generate and to determine for themselves what they want. And so, what we're thinking about here, right, broader scale development in North Tulsa is largely done through philanthropies, right? There's the George Kaiser Family Foundation is one of the biggest real estate developers in North Tulsa right now, right? Building, a series of he's the one who was behind, or his foundation was behind much of the schools, but is also investing heavily in developing, a kind of series of warehouse spaces, right, to create North Tulsa into, another logistics hub, as we've seen, as is the case in other largely rural areas across the country. So what we see is that the access to capital isn't easily understood in terms of where it should be located, and where it is identified ultimately ends up being a challenge in terms of being able to coordinate in a way to kind of again execute the ideal outcome of what the community wants.
So we finally got a number of questions in here. I doubt we'll be able to get to all of them. I'm actually going to speak to one very briefly, the last one that came in about bonding capacity of government and other organizations like universities raising big capital. There's actually an interesting project near where I am, North Carolina Central University is working on a project to raise capital, significant capital around a development project. So feel free to email me. Happy to tell folks more about that one. But let me go back a couple questions. We have a question about reparations agenda with respect to historic Black places. So I wonder if the panel might anyone might want to address that. And we have a couple more questions. So I know that's its own panel, obviously, but in the context of development, maybe I'll contextualize a little bit more and narrow it. People are now broadly talking about reparations and have a wide variety of definitions for what reparations might be, who it might be for, and what it might be for. If we're thinking about development, real estate, commercial residential property specifically, is there a role for thinking about reparations in this context, in part because many of the causes for people to think about reparations for Black people are related to property, land, and ownership of land. So any thoughts there about development, land ownership, property development being a tool for reparations?
Well, it's obvious that the connection to the land when we talk about reparations is a big piece. But we've been talking about access to land, tools, and capital. And something that we haven't talked about is regardless to how strident an advocate you are for our neighborhoods, our people, our needs for capital, all of that, we have to always show the self-interest to the audience that we're talking to. And when you talk reparations in general, there are issues that come up. When you talk targeted reparations, it's much harder to defeat the need. You know, we all understand the fact that this is something that's owed and something that has not been met. So there's no question about that. But when you talk about those entities with capital, those purveyors of capital, in order to get those things done, you have to show them ways in which it can be done in such a way that it's good for the broader economy. Well, obviously, development is good for the broader economy. And there are many ways in which I think you can utilize those tools. I'll just take this quick opportunity to also mention, there was a question in the chat about New Markets tax credits. No question that this fills some of the holes in equity, but not all of the holes. Very often developers, whether they be nonprofit developers or for-profit developers, what is lacking, you can raise the debt, but you can't raise the equity. You can't raise the capital that is indeed your mother's milk investment that you need to bring there. New Markets helps with that, but New Markets are very competitive. Private equity helps with that, but private equity is very competitive. So I'm tying it back to reparations. So within a reparations feedback loop where both New Markets and private equity are set aside only for Black projects, only for projects that represent a reparations approach, then now we're talking about something. And now we're talking about real power.
That's for sure. And whenever we try to do something that is just for Black folk, we're going to get the backlash of anti-racism, et cetera, or that's racist, right? So we also have to be very clear and strong and not back off of the idea of you are not the one to tell anybody, what is racist white developer. We're here to, you know what I mean? So we have to be able to sort of meet that moment because it will come, right? They do not like to see things set aside just for Black thriving, to come back to my original point. Opportunity zones are a tax credit, right? They're a tax vehicle. So being very aware, like whose benefit an opportunity zone was created for, I think is important. I do want to say for New Market tax credits, I would love for community groups and nonprofits to really live out the value they can bring to a New Markets tax credit application, right? Like get the most as that you can from being the local partner in a New Market tax credit. They need you in their applications, right? So do not undervalue whatever number you think you should be asking, whatever you think you should be asking for to partner with somebody in a New Market tax credit application, like double it, right? Because you are that important to their getting the tax credit, which is of so much value to the developer, right? And then my last thing will be the idea of, so sometimes data can come in and it can be a very small but helpful data point. Carmen, if you haven't already, if you could share the link to the transformative development cohort. So I saw some ideas or some questions around co-ops and strategies for cooperative, for grocery stores and other things. Here in Atlanta, there's a great group called the Guild, ATL. I partnered with them in my prior job to do a pilot cohort of developers, all Black women and person of color led developers. And there was one chart in that final report that Carmen will share with you all that shows the appraisal gap, right? So a developer that wants to work in the Black community is right up against this issue we had of how do you value land and buildings in Black places, right? They are devalued. And that creates hundreds of thousands of dollars of gap in a budget, right? If you appraise a building you want to buy in one area and it's $300,000 because it's in the Black neighborhood, but it's $600,000 if it's the same building as in a white neighborhood, that's a hole in a Black developer's budget that they cannot fundraise for, right? So to me, part of reparation would be filling the gaps in a budget of a developer created by racist appraisal, by racist financing systems, by racist planning and zoning, et cetera. So give them the pre-development funds that they need. Do it as equity, do it as grants, 0% loans, whatever you got to do so that they can get some profit, right, and live off of that. So thanks in advance, Carmen, for sharing that report so folks can see a little bit more about how we constructed that cohort, that pilot.
I'll just quickly say, I mean, those are wonderful recommendations. And what we have to keep in mind is when we're thinking about reparations, right, we're thinking about the quality of repair. Right, we're thinking about what it actually means to kind of respond to the injury of slavery and of the kind of consequences that followed. And so there's a way that it, that injury, right, is understood to have been the basis for what we think of as a collective sense of Blackness. That collective sense of Blackness is what we understand to form the basis of our notion of community. So in a way, right, there is a question that has to be answered, which is, what is the relationship between reparations and community formation and the sense of community? I think that latter aspect of that question is something that we continue to wrestle with. Symposia like these are inherently, but sometimes not explicitly, trying to better understand what the idea of Black community means. There's a great deal of contestation around that meaning. There's a great deal of policing around that meaning. And what we see is that there is an opportunity, for the idea of Black community to be used almost in an exploitative manner. This conversation has spoken to that. The panel before ours was getting towards that in terms of when we're thinking about Greenwood, what is the currency of Greenwood? Right? What is the currency of Greenwood today? Yet we see that largely the community of North Tulsa goes unacknowledged, effectively ignored today, in spite of this week, right? Where we're commemorating the 100th year, the centenary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Little discussion is being had about the contemporary Black community of North Tulsa. So, when we're thinking about repair, we have to think about, when we're thinking about reparations, we have to think about what the quality of repair means. So we can think about this as a form of property, right? Restitution. We can think about the particular strategies to help secure access, but we have to also understand what that access looks like, what that access produces. How do these things in fact help create a healthy and robust, not only structural community, but sense of community? That to me is why I think we have to think, about like a multi-scale reparations. And I don't mean this just as a federal, state and local jurisdictional level, which we have to think about it as well. What does the city of Berkeley owe to Black people? It's a question that is as legitimate as what does the United States federal government owe to Black people? We should be asking also a global question, given that slavery was in fact, one of our earliest, we call multinational corporate entities, right? Or had multinational corporate entities involved. So, for me, that has to be a primary question. We have to get that basis worked out, because the truth is that property ownership is a major question for Black people. But when we're thinking about the broader notion of land, Odetta earlier brings up the kind of native the native question that is also needs to be responded to. Right? There are still, Berkeley is unceded territory, right, of the Ohlone people, right? What does it mean for a Black community to have access to property, which that access to property would still fall within a kind of circuit of dispossession and of occupation? So there's a lot of questions that we have to ask. And I think, what we do in answering that question, or these questions, is begin to think about the quality of repair. What does it mean as a Black subject, right, who often feels the weight of the collective injury of slavery in an everyday experience, in a police stop, in being surveilled in a grocery store, right? that is the scale of injury that we need to think about. What does it mean for that to be responded to? What does that actually require?
Yes, so we're going to make a little bit of a shift here because we have a really actually special guest with us. The inspiration for this panel is Greenwood, and we actually have Reverend Turner, who's a pastor of Greenwood Vernon AME Church. It's good to see you again. It's been a little bit. And yes, we'd just love to welcome you to the conversation. I may just say, Jovan, your last comments are really, we should talk offline about that. I think this idea of Black communities defining and Black people broadly defining what repair means is important, because as far as I'm concerned, there's repairing damage, but once that damage is repaired, if it could be, it doesn't mean Black people disappear. It doesn't mean Blackness disappears. And so let's switch to Reverend Turner to tell us about actually what's happening on the ground in Greenwood.
I want to thank you so much for having me. I am sitting in my office on Greenwood Avenue, 307-311 North Greenwood Avenue, at historic Vernon AME Church. And we are a few days away from commemorating, not celebrating, the worst race massacre in American history. The first time that airplanes dropped bombs on American soil happened right here. The first time airplanes were used to terrorize Americans was not at 9/11, but was right here. And so we are here for no celebration, because it is now nearly 100 years later, and we have yet to see justice. For the last two acts of aerial assault, 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, this country went to war in Afghanistan. We killed Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and his two sons. And we're still in Afghanistan today. After Pearl Harbor, we went to Japan and dropped the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, so much so that you can still feel radioactivity today in Chernobyl. But for the very first act of racial terrorism, the very first act of aerial assault, and bombs being dropped on American soil, fast forward 100 years later, not one person has been arrested. Not one person has gone to jail. And so we are here demanding still every Wednesday since September the 12th, 2018. I have sojourned to our city hall at the steps of our city local government, demanding that they recognize the massacre that they did, and demanding repentance and reparations from what the city allowed and did cause to happen. And now, nearly 3 years later, we are still yet without justice. And today we are having, some events that are being held, and we're having events throughout the whole week, to be honest with you. And I just ask everybody to keep us in their thoughts and prayers.
Reverend Turner, I wonder if any of those are events that can be accessed virtually. If they are, if you could share a link and we can share that with the people who are on the conference today.
I will. We at Vernon, we've had one event already, and we're having some more events on Sunday. Of course, the Sunday before the centennial, we're having worship service, and we're having a lot of special guests. And on that Monday, we're beginning also in worship, and at 10 o'clock, we're dedicating our basement survived the race massacre, and we're dedicating the exterior wall of that basement to become a prayer wall for racial healing. Similar to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, this can be the wall for African Americans that survived our terror that we suffer here in this country. And really, outside of Jerusalem, this would be one of the few public prayer walls in the world, and the only prayer wall for racial healing. And it'll be right here at Ground Zero in Greenwood. And so we'll be dedicating that. We're having Reverend Jesse Jackson come in to pray, and several other people. And it's going to be interfaith, right? So Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, people of no faith even, they can come and meditate. But we're asking that people come and be respectful of all traditions and all faith backgrounds. and it'll be open to the whole world.
It's wonderful. Thank you for being here. I have maybe one question, Reverend Turner, that maybe ask you to speak to, and I think hopefully it's one that the rest of the panel can as well. Last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about the history of Greenwood after the massacre and how much of the sort of economic condition that you might see in Greenwood today isn't solely the result of that massacre, and is actually a result of subsequent
That's right.
government interventions in the neighborhood. And so to me, this makes me think of ideas about risk and risk aversion that Black people oftentimes in communities have to development. And it's something that it's in response, not to nothing. It's in response to continued waves of government-sponsored or government intervention in our development. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit of that story, kind of post-massacre, what in Greenwood.
Thank you for that, Mark, brother. You asked a very great question, because what a lot of people don't know is after the devastation of those 18 hours, the people of Greenwood, Black folks, some of them did leave, right? And so everybody was made homeless in 18 hours. All 10,000 Black people who lived here in Greenwood were made homeless. Over 1,256 homes were destroyed. 600 businesses were destroyed. Over 300 people killed in America. 300 people, over 300 people killed. Bodies dumped in mass graves. And that following Sunday, members of our church came to worship. Those following months, the men who were placed in internment camps, as soon as they were released, came back to our church basement to repair it with no help from our insurance, right? So we filed, as you would today, God forbid, a house burns down. You're going to call your insurance company to collect your claim because you pay your premiums. We did that and nobody paid. And we slept in the freezing cold during the winter. So the folks that didn't get killed during the massacre, a lot of them died in the concentration camps, and a lot of them died also in that terrible winter of 1921. But even after all of that, they stayed here in this city, in this community, and they rebuilt their homes, they rebuilt their businesses, they rebuilt their churches to be even bigger and better than before. And they thrived up until the building of the interstate highway in 1967, where they chose deliberately to carve a path through the Black community of Greenwood. And they chose deliberately, according to some of our oral history, to take the interstate over the sites where the bodies were dumped in mass graves, so they would never be found. So when you're driving on some of our interstate highways here, you're driving over dead bodies, Black dead bodies. They chose to put sidewalks over places where we know bodies were dumped. They chose to put them near the train tracks. So as they expanded, they would go. They got housing subdivisions built in places where we have oral history saying that bodies were dumped. And after the interstate highway was built and they cut a huge section of our community, that's really devastated us. And not only did they build the interstate highway through our community, they didn't put an exit ramp. So if you're going to build through a community, at least put an exit ramp to encourage folks to patronize the businesses. They didn't do that. They put the exit ramp up the road near the white businesses and just bulldozed through the Black businesses. And they coupled the building of the interstate highways. At the same time they did that, they were through the city development authority, because the property value had just become depressed from the building of the interstate highway. Now they're coming by offering checks to people through urban, they call renewal. Like, don't you want to sell your house because you see this interstate, you see the community is basically going to hell in a handbasket. Don't you want to sell? And so Black people needed the money. They got the checks, right? They took the checks. They sold their properties for pennies on the dollar of what it was worth. And now as a result, the largest landowner in the Greenwood district, historic Black Wall Street area, is the city of Tulsa, the same city that was complicit at best and a co-conspirator at worst in the largest and most damning race massacre in American history. And as a result, the place where I sit, 307-311 North Greenwood, is the only thing on historic Greenwood that's owned by African Americans. This church is it on Greenwood. Our basement is the only thing that survived the race massacre from 1921 on Greenwood Avenue. We have a few other places in the district, but on historic Greenwood Avenue. And Greenwood Avenue, just to give some context, is like the Rodale Drive of Beverly Hills. It's like the Beale Street of Memphis, like the Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. It's the street everybody wanted to be on, right? So the fact we have a Greenwood Avenue address says a lot. And this basement is the only thing we have left from that era. And we are the oldest continuous landowner, black or white, in the whole district. We've owned our piece of land since 1908. And when they came offering checks, we did not accept it. And the pastor of our church at that time was trying to plead with the membership and the community to not accept the checks, because he knew even back then we would never see this much land again. And he was right, unfortunately.
So we're over time, but I maybe want to. No, it's not because of you. We were already over time. But maybe I want to kind of flip this to the rest of the panel as this question. As we're thinking about Black communities and Black PACEs that have not necessarily had the exact same story as Greenwood, but have had similar stories of waves of kind of government intervention to prevent progress, to remove wealth, that does impact how people and how communities think about themselves and the agency that they have in creating change, in wanting to engage in a development process, right? As we kind of go back to these things. So I'm wondering, for the rest of the panel, if you have any closing words of sort of thought, advice, reflection on what members of Black communities, how they should be thinking about the history that they themselves, that their families may have gone through, and how that doesn't have to necessarily prevent or keep them from being active agents in controlling the future of themselves and their communities.
I've been thinking a lot recently about my grandfather. So my father's from Grenada, and his father, when he knew it was time to set his affairs in order, created an LLC in the island of Grenada and put as the sole asset of that corporation the home he had purchased for retirement for himself and his wife, and they had 7 children, so that spanned a minute, and so some of the siblings grew up in this house. And in my role with CCP, with Center for Community Progress, just really starting to begin to understand the scope and contours of things like heirs property challenges that African American communities faced in quieting title, and even the concept of quiet title. Just the idea that we have to figure out, sometimes there's going to be disrupting a system that was not built for our thriving. Are there ways to, kind of jujitsu, right? Use the momentum for our benefit. So the idea that there's a corporation with this one house as its asset, and the 7 children of my grandfather are each equal shareholders. And so behind the legal scenes, as a family, they get to hash out whoever's going to pay for what and what. But when it comes time to pay taxes or deal with the system, it's the LLC, right? The bank knows it knows who to go to, so that the family can engage the systems around it, but do so in a way that protects their ownership of this home. So I hope that we continue to, as a people in this country, not only create the empathetic capital that we need, that reflects what we know we need and all of the other structures, but let's also see if there aren't some ways to take the existing systems and make them protect us a little better. because they were not created to protect us. So we have to figure out how to make them do that. I'm very moved by Reverend Turner's remarks. And thank you so much. We'll be doing everything I can to signal boost the event and the cause for sure. And just thanks so much for including me in this panel. It's been a really, really good time, well spent time this afternoon, heading into the weekend. Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo Adetta's comments to the Reverend Dr. Robert Turner. As I listen to you, it's impossible not to think back to my own study of what happened in Tulsa and the several books that I've read about the populations and what they were able to achieve in the coming years. And Mark's question brings us to another tool that we did not lift up enough here. Whether the area is historically a place that is a Black place, or whether it's historically a place where reparations should be given, or whether it's historically a place where the kind of public-private collaboration to injure Black capital, Black wealth, and Black ownership of land, one of the most important tools is to form a community development corporation and be in a situation where you have an organized entity that understands development, that can aggregate capital, that can deal with regulation, and can also begin to address the ills that Mark talked about. Many of our communities have formed community development corporations. There are thousands. Some of them have gone through very difficult times and are now rebirthing themselves. But it is a vehicle that we cannot abandon, and it's a vehicle that other forms of capital are starting to realize, well, wait a minute, what we need here is a CDC. Well, yes, and therefore we have to revitalize some of the CDCs and form new ones. In communities where there are community actors and not necessarily good ways, good methodologies to bring together assets, resources, and advocacy, a community development corporation can be that tool. I'll also thank my colleagues, two brilliant folks here, Javon and Odetta, a very, very talented collaborator and moderator in Mark, who also could have been one of the brilliant panelists. And I thank Elijah, Laano, and others for the work that they've done in bringing this together. And I too am very grateful to have been included. I'm complete.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Reverend Doctor, thank you for, as I made a note in the chat, thank you for continuing that fight. There is so much I want to say actually in response to Mark's final question. Mark, what are you doing? I just, when we think about, I just keep thinking about the AME Reverend trying to encourage, his community to not sell. And I think, we have to remember, I think that there's a couple of ways we can think about that. One, which is that if we look at the history of migration, of Black migration, internal Black migration, we can think about that as being a larger part of a larger migration, right? Forcible. But what that tells me is that, we can think of it two ways. One, it's the disaggregating of community, but the other is that there's a constant, again, I'm going to end on the note of imagination, but there's a constant will to imagine a new future, right? And I think, what that looks like is in part community formation, community solidarity, through all of the tools that my brilliant colleagues here have spoken about today, many of which, I'm just learning about as far as tools of doing this political work. But it is about maintaining that notion of community as one rooted in self-determination. I think one of the biggest, I'm so glad that we talked today about how it wasn't just the race massacre in 1921 that undid Greenwood, but it was something as banal as an expressway, which we can see, again, we're talking about my South Florida roots, right? We have to think about Liberty City as being one of the first locations in this country, right, that was devastated by some of those policies. The first location in this country that had what we call social housing created. Now, But one of the other devastating consequences has just been, again, the narrowing of our imagination, right? The idea that we can't think past our circumstances. Never before, right? Prior to the civil rights era, right? Have Black people in this country limited the imagination of what we can accomplish, limited the imagination of what our communities can be. And so I want to say, in addition to the very real and meaningful, strategies that Odetta and Irvin and Mark has talked about today, is to kind of really try and regenerate that notion of imagination. And so that's why I made a comment earlier about, as we are commemorating, this year in Greenwood, while we are celebrating the history of Greenwood, right? I want us to also remember North Tulsa. Reverend Doctor, I've been doing work with the North Tulsa community for the past several years, and I'm just devastated, frankly, by how much of the notion of North Tulsa as an identified community is left out of so many of the conversations that have been happening, right? Everybody and their mother has come out to the woodworks to write an op-ed about Greenwood, right? People who have never been to Tulsa, but in none of these articles are they talking about the contemporary Black lives that are in Tulsa. It seems as if Black lives only matter once they're dead, right? And the continuing Black livingness that we see in a place like North Tulsa, which is just merely minutes drive away from historic Greenwood, has gone, effectively silenced once again. And so I think, what I would just say as a lasting comment is just to kind of rethink what these, to remember that we have a very powerful resource, our number one source of capital, as Reverend Dr. Turner noted, right? The ability to rebuild, right, has been constantly our number one resource. And just to remember that, that's what I would just say as an ending. Yeah.
I want to thank the panel so much. Sorry, Jovan, for asking questions that make us want to keep talking. I will just say one thing kind of related to what you were speaking about the ability and will of Black people to create after devastation. And if we take even a little bit look back further, after the ending of slavery, the grand proliferation of all these places that we're talking about. I mean, when you read it's like fantasy world. I mean, we talk about, an Afro-future. I mean, we did it. The complexity of organizations and capital and entrepreneurship and imagination and diversity of ideas, international scope of thinking was phenomenal. And I say this in some hope. We have gone ourselves through this past year an extraordinary devastation globally, but also specifically for people of African descent in the United States. And I see some elements of a reimagining, a reinstallation of this hope and ability to have that vision, ability to say, maybe we're not going to sell that property, Reverend Turner, that's happening right now. New sources, new ideas around capital, that in new Black communities actually being built, right? Ashley Scott down in Georgia is building a new Black town. So I'm hopeful in this moment that, like after some of these incidents, what Black people have been able to create. And I'm also hopeful that we are wily enough to understand and see and prepare for the inevitable, unfortunately, resistance that may come when that success starts to grow. Thank you so much to the conference for having this panel, for allowing me to moderate. Really appreciate Reverend Turner for popping in. Good to see you again, sir. Thank you for telling us what we need to be paying attention to this week. And I will hand it over to the conference organizers to take us to the next thing.